In 2015, a 31-year-old woman stood on stage and told the world she had invented a machine that could detect cancer from a single drop of blood. She was celebrated by presidents, praised by billionaires, worth $4.5 billion on paper, and every single word was a lie. She convinced Henry Kissinger to join her board. She persuaded Rupert Murdoch to invest $125 million. She got Joe Biden to tour her lab, a lab she had staged with fake equipment for the visit. Behind the curtain, her machines could only perform 12 of the 250 tests she claimed. Patients were receiving false cancer screenings, incorrect HIV results. A 67-year-old scientist took his own life rather than lie under oath. This is the story of the biggest fraud in Silicon Valley history. This is the Theranos file. For decades, blood testing had not fundamentally changed. You went to a clinic, a nurse inserted a needle into your vein and filled several glass vials with blood. That blood was shipped to a centralized lab and processed by massive machines. You waited days, sometimes weeks, for results. Doctors make 70% of their clinical decisions based on lab results. A delayed test means a delayed diagnosis. A delayed diagnosis can mean the difference between catching cancer early and catching it too late. Elizabeth Holmes said she could change all of it. Her company Theranos promised a machine no bigger than a desktop printer that could run hundreds of tests from a finger prick. No needles, no vials, no waiting. Just a tiny drop of blood and a few minutes for results. If it worked, it would have been the biggest revolution in medicine since the X-ray. It did not work, but that did not stop her from building a $9 billion empire on the promise that it did. Elizabeth Ann Holmes was born on February 3, 1984, in Washington, D.C. She grew up in a family that talked about wealth and legacy the way other families talked about the weather. When relatives asked young Elizabeth what she wanted to be when she grew up, her answer was always the same: a billionaire. Her father was a vice president at Enron, the energy company that would later collapse in one of the largest accounting fraud scandals in American history. She was accepted to Stanford in 2002 to study chemical engineering. In 2003, during the SARS epidemic, she traveled to Singapore to work at the Genome Institute and saw the limitations of diagnostic methods firsthand. When she returned to Stanford, she locked herself in her room for 5 days and emerged with a patent application for a wearable arm patch that would diagnose illnesses and deliver medication through the skin in real time. She was 19. She had no medical degree, no chemistry background beyond a few semesters. But she had something more powerful than credentials. She had a story, and she told it brilliantly. When Elizabeth approached a Stanford professor of medicine with her idea, the professor told her it was impossible. It defied the laws of physics. Elizabeth did not listen. She dropped out of Stanford in 2004 and founded the company that same year. It was originally called Real-Time Cures, though an unfortunate typo on the early paychecks spelled it Real-Time Curses. She renamed it Theranos, a combination of the words therapy and diagnosis. Raising money came easily. Her first investor wrote her a check for $1 million on the spot. He did not understand the science, but he understood the fear of missing out. By the end of 2004, Theranos had raised nearly $6 million. If you asked Elizabeth how the technology worked, she would say, a chemistry is performed so that a chemical reaction occurs and generates a signal from the chemical interaction with the sample, which is translated into a result, which is then reviewed by certified laboratory personnel. That sentence says nothing. It is a verbal magic trick designed to sound impressive while meaning absolutely nothing. But the people with money did not ask follow-up questions. In 2006, Elizabeth flew to Switzerland to present the Theranos device to Novartis. The night before the demo, the machine was malfunctioning. Any honest chief executive would have admitted the flaw and rescheduled. Instead, Elizabeth had her team back in California send pre-calculated test results ahead of time. At the demo, they pricked a finger, inserted the cartridge, the machine spun, and instead of flashing its usual error message, it spat out the results from California. The Swiss investors believed the machine had actually tested their blood. When the chief financial officer found out and confronted her, she fired him on the spot. And then she never hired another chief financial officer for the next 10 years. To understand why Theranos was doomed, you need to understand how blood testing actually works. Traditional blood testing draws several milliliters of blood from your vein. That sample goes to a lab where massive machines run different types of tests. Each test requires a specific volume, a specific method, and a specific type of analyzer. Theranos claimed they could shrink all of this into a single desktop device called the Edison. Just a finger prick, just a few drops. The problem was physics. When you dilute a tiny blood sample to run multiple tests, you spread it so thin that the results become unreliable. When you pack different testing components close together, heat and electrical interference corrupt each other's readings. These were not engineering problems you could solve with a clever hack. They were fundamental limits of the technology. And the Edison was far from a miracle. Elizabeth had commissioned a former Logitech employee to build it. He bought a $3,000 mechanical arm, the kind used in manufacturing, and programmed it to mimic the movements of a chemist. The result was a machine that insiders described as an 8th-grade science project. Pipette tips would constantly break off, get stuck in the gears, and cause the entire mechanism to jam. When the tips would not eject, technicians would use coat hangers to free up the gears or reach in with their bare hands, subjecting themselves to toxic chemicals like potassium cyanide. When the Edison did work, which was rare, it could only perform a limited range of tests, not even close to what Elizabeth had been telling investors. In 2009, Elizabeth hired a man named Ramesh Sunny Balwani. He had no scientific or medical background, but he had money and loyalty. Sunny had made $40 million when a company he joined was sold just before the dot-com bubble burst. He had met Elizabeth on a trip to China when she was 18 and he was 37. Their romantic relationship was kept secret from investors, the board, and employees. As second in command, Sunny was described by employees as overbearing, uncompromising, and paranoid. He sent Elizabeth text messages calling himself the Tiger. Meanwhile, he was fabricating financial projections. The internal forecasts showed one number. The ones given to investors showed 10 times that. Elizabeth and Sunny operated as co-conspirators, one charming the outside world, the other terrorizing the inside. Elizabeth Holmes did not just want to be a chief executive officer, she wanted to be the next Steve Jobs. She wore the same black turtleneck every day. She scheduled marketing meetings on Wednesdays because Steve did. She hired the same advertising agency Apple used. She even referred to her technology as the iPod of healthcare. She spoke in a deep, deliberate baritone, a voice so unnaturally low that people who had known her before Stanford said it was an act. On occasion, she would slip, use her natural voice, then catch herself and drop several octaves. The media could not get enough. Fortune put her on the cover, Forbes named her the youngest self-made female billionaire. Time named her among the 100 most influential people in the world. The board of directors added to the mythology. Henry Kissinger, James Mattis, George Shultz, men whose credentials made the company look untouchable, and who had no medical expertise to challenge her claims. In July 2015, Vice President Joe Biden visited Theranos' California facility. Elizabeth staged an entire fake lab, cobbled together from defunct equipment that could not actually do anything. Biden praised her as a leading figure in medicine on national news. Theranos' credibility was not built on data. It was built on partnerships. In 2010, Theranos reached out to Walgreens, insisting they could run any blood test from a finger prick, a pitch they knew was a lie. Walgreens was terrified of losing out to their rival CVS. A consultant warned that Theranos might be overselling their capabilities. Walgreens executives were undeterred. One said, "We cannot not pursue this." We cannot risk a scenario where CVSS has a deal with them in 6 months and it ends up being real. When Theranos went live in Walgreens stores in 2013, they were drawing blood the traditional way, from the vein, and secretly running tests on commercial Siemens analyzers, not the Edison. The finger prick that was supposed to revolutionize medicine had been quietly abandoned. The very method Theranos set out to destroy was the one they were using behind the curtain. In 2013, a court subpoenaed Ian Gibbons, Theranos' chief scientist. Ian was 67 years old. He held over 60 patents. His wife, Rochelle, later said he told me he could not imagine why people were giving the company any money because there was no invention, there was nothing there. Elizabeth lies about everything. Ian had raised his concerns multiple times. He was fired, rehired, demoted, all within a couple of hours. He was scheduled to testify in 2 days, and he feared anything he said under oath would expose the company and violate his non-disclosure agreement. The next morning, his wife found him in the bathroom. He had overdosed on Tylenol. He died in the hospital a week later. Elizabeth Holmes never returned Rochelle's call. An office manager called back, asking her to return Ian's company property. And then there were the patients. A woman was told she was miscarrying when she was still pregnant. Another received a false positive on an HIV test. A third was wrongfully instructed to stop taking her blood-thinning medication, a decision that could have been fatal. These were not broken iPhones. These were broken diagnoses. While Ian Gibbons' family mourned, the money kept flowing. Rupert Murdoch invested $125 million. The Walton family put in $150 million. The DeVos family added $100 million, all based on fabricated projections. Theranos was valued at $9 billion. Elizabeth Holmes' personal stake was $4.5 billion. If you are finding this story hard to believe, stick around. Because the way it all unraveled is even more disturbing than the fraud itself. And if you are new here, this is Rec Ledger. Every empire leaves a ledger. Hit subscribe. Tyler Shultz was 26 when he started working at Theranos. His grandfather was George Shultz, the former Secretary of State who sat on the Theranos board. What Tyler witnessed was far from the utopia Elizabeth pitched. Departments were walled off. Employees were prohibited from speaking to colleagues in other divisions. When the machines malfunctioned, error reports were torn down so nobody could count the failures. Tyler told Elizabeth. He told Sonny. He told his own grandfather. George Shultz chose the company over his own grandson. So Tyler went to John Carreyrou at the Wall Street Journal. Theranos fought back with everything. They hired David Boies, the legendary attorney, paid in Theranos stock, so he was financially obligated to protect the company. They sent threatening letters to whistleblowers. They hired private investigators to follow people who had spoken to the Journal. They ran up massive legal bills for Tyler's parents, nearly forcing them to sell their house. They even asked Rupert Murdoch, their own investor and the owner of the Wall Street Journal, to personally kill the story. He refused. On October 15, 2015, the Wall Street Journal published Carreyrou's investigation. Elizabeth pushed back, calling the reporting erroneous, but the dam was breaking. The Food and Drug Administration found that the Edison could only perform 12 of 250 claimed tests, and even those produced wildly erratic results. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services sent a letter stating the lab had failed to comply with federal standards to an extent that put patients' lives in immediate jeopardy. Walgreens closed all 40 Theranos locations and sued for $140 million. Safeway dissolved its partnership after sinking $350 million. In May 2016, Theranos voided nearly 2 years of blood test results. Patients who had relied on those results received letters telling them their diagnoses may have been wrong. Forbes reduced Elizabeth's net worth from $4.5 billion to zero. Theranos was dissolved in September 2018. Elizabeth Holmes and Sonny Balwani were charged with massive fraud. Elizabeth had illegally placed the Pfizer and Johns Hopkins logos on fabricated lab reports to burnish credibility. She was found guilty on 4 of 11 federal charges and sentenced to 11 years and 3 months in federal prison. Sonny was convicted on all 12 counts and sentenced to nearly 13 years. Through all of it, the trial, the conviction, the sentencing, Elizabeth Holmes never apologized. Not to patients, not to investors, not to Ian Gibbons' family, not once. Every empire leaves a ledger. Theranos ledger shows $900 million in investor losses. Patients who received false cancer screenings and incorrect HIV results. A 67-year-old scientist who chose death over perjury. Whistleblowers who were threatened, followed, and nearly bankrupted for telling the truth. And a woman who almost got away with it because the people with the power to stop her chose to believe the performance instead of the evidence. The machines never worked. The money was never real. The ledger was always a lie. This has been the Theranos File. If this is your first time at RecLedger, we tell the stories the powerful do not want told, one file at a time. Hit subscribe and the bell so you do not miss the next one. Next up, how Boeing destroyed itself. That is the Downfall File.